right, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm Patrick Byers, horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension. I'm excited to be with you here tonight to talk about produce food safety through the lens of community gardens and urban farms and small-scale specialty crop farmers. And I'm excited to introduce my colleague, Hannah Hodge. Hannah, do you want to say a few words on behalf of yourself and Springfield Community Gardens?
Hi. I am with Springfield Community Gardens, and I will be the moderator. So if you have anything to ask, feel free to submit that to the chat. However, this is a pre-recorded video. So if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to comment and we will get to your questions as soon as we can.
Very good, thank you. Okay, well, without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Actually, hold on just a second. Got to make sure I push all the right buttons. Okay, Hannah, can we see the screen?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, excellent. Hide the floating meeting controls. Well, I'm Patrick Byers, horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm excited to be with you here tonight. The topic of our workshop tonight is food safety for farm and garden. And we're going to approach produce food safety from the standpoint of the lens of community gardens, home gardens, and small-scale specialty crop farmers. This is definitely an overview. The subject matter in this presentation is obviously deserves much more of a deep attention dive. And for those who are interested in a broader exposure to produce food safety, I'll mention that University of Missouri Extension periodically sponsors the Produce Safety Alliance Food Safety Modernization Act mandatory training, which is an 8-hour training that delves deeply into all aspects of produce food safety. And we invite you to join us at those trainings. Tonight's workshop is a partnership with Springfield Community Gardens in Springfield, Missouri. The vision of Springfield Community Gardens is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. The Springfield Community Gardens has two very innovative programs I wanted to highlight. One is the Farmer Incubator Program. And if you're in Southwest Missouri and you're interested in learning more about the Farmer Incubator Program, if you feel that you might be interested in becoming a farmer, please reach out to Springfield Community Gardens. And the second project is the Cox Hospital Farm. Again, a very innovative partnership with Cox Medical Systems in Springfield to develop a hospital farm that'll provide fresh, locally grown, nutritionally dense produce that then enters into the community at Cox Hospital. So please reach out to Springfield Community Gardens, visit their website or visit their Facebook site. This is also a good place to learn about upcoming workshops, and we'll have a number of workshops as we move into 2021. Now, why should we be concerned about produce food safety? Well, here are some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. First of all, again, why we should be concerned. Secondly, we'll examine the contaminants, those agents that can make us sick based upon the food that we eat. We'll talk about site selection, how that plays a role in keeping produce safe. We'll talk about hygiene and health and how all of us who contact produce have a role to play. We'll talk about water and irrigation, soil, manure, and compost. Then we'll touch on animals in the field. And then we'll end up with a discussion of the harvest and post-harvest management aspects of produce and how that impacts produce food safety. I do have some action items for you tonight. Please fill out the evaluation that will be available at the end of the workshop. The evaluation is very important to help me continuously improve my presentations, but our workshop is also a partnership with the USDA. The USDA has provided funding for these workshops, and they expect some feedback from attendees in response. And so we appreciate your participation in the evaluation to help our funders understand how effective the program was. I encourage everyone to visit the Produce Safety Alliance website. This is the outreach branch of the Food Safety Modernization Act. Tremendous number of resources available there, both for home gardeners, community gardens, and produce growers. Visit the North Carolina State University Community Garden Food Safety website. This particular website has a number of resources of interest to community gardeners and produce food safety. And as I mentioned earlier, we have an upcoming Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Alliance training. This will be a remote delivery training available on the internet, 2 days, January 21st and 28th, 4 hours each day. And if you're interested, please register at the Kansas State University Produce Food Safety website. And there's more information on the training at that particular site. And I encourage anyone who has questions related to produce food safety to please reach out. And we'd be happy to help with information or anything else related to produce food safety. Okay, let's move into our workshop. First of all, why should we be concerned about produce food safety? Well, that question may sound like it has an obvious answer, but let's delve a little bit deeper into the situation. In the United States, it's estimated that 1 out of 4 Americans will suffer a foodborne illness each year. And this is a lot of Americans. And this is in the neighborhood of somewhere around 76 million illnesses, 325,000 hospitalizations, and unfortunately, 5,000 plus deaths from foodborne illness. Now, the reality is that foodborne illness is underreported in this country. And in many cases, people who are suffering from foodborne illness attribute their symptoms to other illnesses. So in fact, these numbers are underreported. Foodborne illness is a serious situation in the United States. And which produce items have been linked to foodborne illness outbreaks? Well, here's some data from the USDA or from the Food and Drug Administration. The reporting period was 1996 to 2014. And if we look at this pie chart, we can notice that there's 2 produce items in particular that have been implicated in a number of foodborne illness outbreaks, and those are sprouts and leafy greens. If we look at the next 3 items, which are melons, tomatoes, and berries, among those produce items, another quarter of foodborne illnesses are traced back to those 3 items. So if we look at those 5 items, the majority of foodborne illness, nearly 75%, can be attributed to people consuming those produce items. But there are a lot of other produce items that can make people ill based upon consumption of contaminated produce. And if we look at the remainder of this, we can see produce items such as herbs, cucumbers, green onions, mangoes, almonds, grapes, papayas, and others. And in fact, there's a significant portion of this pie chart that is unknown. We know that the illness outbreaks were caused by consuming contaminated produce, but in some cases, it's very difficult to pinpoint the exact cause of a foodborne illness outbreak. Now, what would we consider at-risk produce? Well, the first consideration is produce that's eaten fresh without cooking. And there are many items of produce that we enjoy eating fresh. You know, think about the pleasures of a handful of fresh raspberries or a tossed green salad with mixed greens, or a sliced cucumber or a sliced tomato on our hamburger. All of these are produce items that we enjoy eating and eating fresh without cooking. Now, the reality is that if we cooked every produce item before consumption, produce would be much safer. But we do enjoy eating produce raw. The second criteria is produce that is in close contact with the soil. So if we think about that pie chart that we saw earlier, greens are there, melons are there, berries are there. Those are all items that are close to the soil. Spinach, root veggie, summer squash, these are examples of produce items that are at risk because they're produced in a setting that is close to the soil. Well, isn't the solution just wash the produce? Well, the reality is that once produce is contaminated, it is very difficult and in many cases impossible to clean up that produce. Contamination can lodge within natural openings on produce. It can lodge within produce items. And once there, it's very difficult or impossible to clean it up. Because of this, it's much better to take a proactive approach to contamination. In other words, preventing contamination from occurring in the first place. And that is the fundamental aspect of risk management when it comes to managing foodborne illnesses and produce. Be proactive, prevent contamination. Now, where can contamination occur? Does it just occur in the harvest aspect? Does it just occur when it's being transported to market? No, the reality is the contamination with microbial pathogens can take place at any point from the production field to the fork going into someone's mouth. So it can certainly happen in the garden or in the field. It can happen during harvesting and handling. It can happen during distribution and sharing and also happen in the home. So in other words, garden to fork, there are risk points all along the continuum from where produce is grown to where produce is consumed. Now, what about urban settings? Again, we are seeing a resurgence of interest in growing produce in urban areas, both in community gardens and on urban farms. Well, some things to consider in an urban setting. Frequently, lots of people are involved in growing these crops. In a community garden setting, for example, there may be leadership, there may be volunteers, there may be plot holders. The community at large may be invited to visit a community garden. All of these people can be potential sources of contamination. On an urban farm, we oftentimes have free access to the garden or the farm by animals. These could be wild animals, feral animals, domestic animals, or pets. Oftentimes, there's limited control over activities in the garden or in the field in an urban setting. And then, of course, there's unknowns, previous uses of that particular site that's now being used to grow produce, and activities by neighbors. These are all considerations that are somewhat unique to urban settings, and all considerations that we need to be aware of and that we need to take into account when it comes to assessing the risk of foodborne illness. Why should we be concerned? Well, let's talk now about good agricultural practices. Much of what we're going to talk about tonight is risk management. Much of what we're going to talk about are good agricultural practices that help reduce the risk of microbial contamination to food. The goal, of course, is to help ensure the produce is safe for gardeners, for customers, and for those that we share with. And also, there's another aspect to this as well, and that's to protect you, the farmer or the gardener, in the event of an outbreak. So again, good agricultural practices are good common sense. Food safety culture. It's important that everyone involved with produce, farmers, community gardeners, home gardeners, share a set of values, attitudes, values, and beliefs that are centered on food safety. This is part of the community that we see in the word community garden or school garden. It's part of that community aspect. And we need to foster that set of shared attitudes, values, and belief. Everyone has a role to play in ensuring that the produce that we grow in a community garden, in an urban farm, in a produce farm in a rural area is safe for the people that we're going to provide that food for their consumption. Do we have any questions at this point, Hannah?
No questions at this time.
Now let's turn our attention to the contaminants. What are the things that can make us sick that could be present on food that we eat? Let's start with biological contaminants. There have been a number of bacteria, viruses, and parasites that have been implicated in foodborne illness outbreaks. These are the common ones. There's others as well, but E. coli 0157H7 is a very pathogenic strain of E. coli that has caused a number of foodborne illness outbreaks. Cyclospora, hepatitis A, Listeria monocytogenes, which causes listeriosis, norovirus, salmonella, and Shigella species. All of these organisms can make people sick if they consume produce items that have been contaminated with these. So again, there's a range of biological contaminants. By far, the majority of foodborne illnesses are caused by bacteria, but there are also virus-based and parasite-based foodborne illness outbreaks. So it's important to consider all of these when we talk about the potential biological contaminants on produce. Where do these biological contaminants come from? Well, the majority of these biological contaminants are traced back to a contamination event that involved feces or poop. And this could be from a human source, from an animal source. It could be manure, animals, or people. But again, feces or poop is a primary source of contamination. And we want to do everything we can to keep the poop off the produce. That's sort of a mantra that those of us involved in produce food safety training repeat. Keep the poop off the produce. Contamination can also come from people with illnesses. People who contact produce that have a communicable illness can also spread biological contamination. And then a third source is contaminated water. Now, frequently, water is contaminated in its own right from feces or poop. But water can very quickly spread contamination widely. So again, feces, people with illnesses, and contaminated water are the primary sources of biological contaminants. What about non-biological contaminants? What about other things that can make us sick that are not based upon a living organism? Well, there are some things to consider. Certainly, heavy metal contamination can lead to long-term problems with contamination, especially lead and arsenic. A contamination of a production site from petroleum distillates, gasoline, and other petroleum-based materials can similarly make people sick. Contamination with pesticides and fertilizers is another risk. And then, of course, there's the risk from physical contaminants, pieces of glass, pieces of metal, trash, other types of debris. And then occasionally other more novel contaminants can be a problem as well. But again, it's not just a question of biological contaminants, but also non-biological contaminants. Now, for the remainder of our time together tonight, we are going to focus on biological contaminants. Do we have any questions at this point, Hannah?
No questions at this time, but feel free to submit any questions you may have in the chat.
Now let's turn our attention to site selection, choosing a site in which to grow produce, whether it be a community garden, an urban farm, a fruit and vegetable farm in the country, or even a home garden. There are some things to consider from the standpoint of produce food safety and site selection. So what is the history of the site that we are considering using for produce production? Well, some things to think about. If we can do a background check, we can learn about the suitability of the site for gardening. For example, this picture here is a picture of a community garden site in Joplin, Missouri. And Joplin, Missouri has a long history of extensive mining for lead and zinc. And in the course of those mining practices, there actually was contamination of many sites within the urban areas in that region in Jasper County. And so it's always a good practice to evaluate carefully a site in an area such as this for problems with things such as heavy metal contamination. We want to pay special attention to the soil. Obviously, the soil is the basis of production, but it can also be a source of contamination. Understanding the history of the site can give us a feel for the risk for flooding. And flooding is its own risk from the standpoint of produce food safety. Floodwaters can very quickly bring contaminants onto a site and contaminate an entire garden or an entire production field. Understanding the history of the site can give us a feel for whether or not that site is used by animals. Here we're looking for evidence of animal trails, animal tracks, other evidence that animals use that site. And we're also going to look around at what's going on in the areas around the proposed site. Is it close to, for example, a sanitary waste facility? Is it close to animal agriculture? Is it close to some other risk that might cause a problem that might potentially spread contamination risks onto the site in which we want to grow produce? So again, very important to do a history of the site to understand what some of the potential risks might be. So what can we do to lower the safety risk? Well, we can obtain the history of the site. Now, sometimes this can be a challenge, but there are ways that you can track down what that site has been used for in the past. Talk to the previous owners. This can be very helpful. In urban areas, contact planning officials. Ask the community, particularly long-standing agencies, local, federal, and state agencies may have information. For example, the Cooperative Extension Office in that county may have some information. Other community members may be able to help as well. And then there's no substitute for visiting the site and evaluating potential risks. And as I mentioned, obviously the site itself, but also look around and understand what's going on in proximity to the site where we're considering growing produce. Conduct a soil test. This should always be part of evaluating a site. Obviously, the soil test will give us information on soil chemistry and the suitability of the site for specialty crop production. It may also give us some information on soil health, but it can also give us some information on potential contaminants. For example, ask for a heavy metals test when you send in your soil sample. And the University of Missouri Soil Testing Laboratory can conduct a heavy metal test, and it's a very reasonable fee for the value of the information that you receive back. And again, particularly in an urban setting, it's a good practice to request a heavy metals test. Some other ways that we can lower the safety risk: make sure that we store all pesticides and fertilizer in a secure fashion so that we don't unwittingly contaminate sites. And this, of course, is important, especially when children are present. Make sure that we use pesticides and fertilizers only as indicated and only as guided by the labels on the containers. Remember, the label is there to give us information on how to use a pesticide or a fertilizer safely. So again, follow all label requirements and then protect yourself as well by wearing personal protective equipment if needed and if recommended by the label. Hannah, do we have any questions at this point?
No questions or Q&A.
Okay, very good. The next subject that I'd like to talk about is hygiene and health. So is hand washing important? Well, you're talking to a produce food safety specialist, and the answer is an unqualified yes. This is interesting now that we're in the holiday season. A number of years back, there was a widespread outbreak of hepatitis A in Denver. And it was all traced back to a catering company that had hired a person who had hepatitis A and who didn't practice good personal hygiene. And this catering business catered a number of holiday parties, and over 15,000 people were exposed to hepatitis A in that particular outbreak. So again, traced back to a single person who had a communicable disease that didn't practice good hygiene. So again, it's obvious that good hand washing is critical from the standpoint of managing foodborne illnesses. So how important is hand washing? At least 50% of foodborne illnesses are directly related to poor hand washing. Now, of course, in the current COVID era, we all have heard lots and lots about hand washing. But hand washing is important at all times. Even if we're not battling a pandemic, hand washing is critically important. So when should we wash our hands? Well, there's some obvious times, obviously after using the toilet, before and after treating a cut or a wound, after smoking, eating, or drinking, after handling compost, after handling garbage or plant debris, after caring for or touching animals, before you handle produce, and after engaging in activities that soil your hands. There's likely many other times when you should wash your hands as well. But again, washing your hands adequately is a critically important risk management practice. And all of us who are involved with produce, whether it be in a community garden, in a home garden, on a specialty crop farm, must understand the importance of adequate hand washing. What about washing hands in the garden and field? What if we are separated from a bathroom, for example, or another setting where we have a permanent installation for hand washing? Well, let's put in a portable hand washing station. These are very simple, very straightforward. They can be homemade. All we need is a reservoir of clean, potable water, a way to dispense that water, something to catch or something to provide soap, something to catch the soapy water in, and then single-use towels and a trash can. And there are lots of creative ways that you can meet these basic needs from the standpoint of a hand washing station. You can also purchase ready-made portable stations as we see in the upper picture. But again, remember, all you need is potable running water, soap, single-use towels, and a trash can to dispose the waste in. Now, of course, do you really know how to wash your hands? And I've done many exercises with audiences where I've provided them with a material. It's called Glow Germ that glows under black light. And I ask them to rub that into their hands, and this is simulating a contamination event. And then I ask them to go to the restroom and thoroughly and adequately wash their hands. And then they come back, I shine the black light on, and we talk about any areas that were missed. And if we look at this diagram here, we can see some of the areas that are commonly missed in hand washing. The first hand there is the back of the hand. So look at that, the back of the thumb. That's an area that's commonly missed. The nails are commonly missed. And in fact, as we wash our hands, we should be using a nail brush to make sure that we get those nails clean. The next picture, the other hand, is the front of the hand. And if we look at that, we notice that there are areas, particularly between the thumb and the forefinger, that are missed. The tips of the fingers are missed as well. Another thing to point out is that the process, again, we should all understand this, is first to wet hands, hopefully with warm water if possible. Apply soap to the hands, and then lather the hands briskly for 20 seconds. Concentrate on palm to palm, palm on back of hands, claw paws in palms, between your fingers, scrub your forearm near your wrists, and the left and right hands. Now, why do I say left and right hands? Well, it's interesting. Studies have shown that when you wash hands, your dominant hand frequently does not get washed as thoroughly as your non-dominant hand. So for example, if you're left-handed, your left hand will not be washed as well as your right hand. And again, that's because you're using your left hand in a more dominant fashion to wash your right hand. So you want to consciously make sure that both hands get adequately washed. And then rinse thoroughly with potable water, towel dry with disposable paper towels, and dispose of the paper towels in a trash can or a waste basket. Remember, lathering for less than 20 seconds is not good enough. How long is 20 seconds? Happy birthday, twice. Say the alphabet to yourself, twice. Then you know that you've achieved 20 seconds. But again, critically important to wash your hands properly. What about using hand sanitizers? Well, are they a substitute for hand washing? Well, the answer again is emphatically no. Research has demonstrated that you cannot adequately clean hands without using soap and water and a vigorous scrubbing action. Okay, if you use sanitizers on unclean hands, they will not adequately clean your hands. Now, certainly sanitizers can be helpful if hands have been cleaned. And so sanitizers do have a place, but hands must be cleaned with potable water, soap, dried with a clean towel before a sanitizer is used. What about gloves? Can those substitute for hand washing? The answer is, again, no. Hands must be washed before being gloved, and hands must be dry before putting on gloves. Now, gloves oftentimes make us careless, and it's very easily and quickly a situation where gloves become contaminated. You know, if you use your gloved hand to scratch your ear, it's been contaminated. If you use your gloved hand to lean on a countertop, it's been contaminated. If you use your gloved hand to pick something up off the floor, it's been contaminated. So gloves should be used for only one task, one dedicated task, and you have to be consciously thinking about your gloved hands. Now, what about when you're done with your gloves? Well, take them off and wash your hands at this point. So gloves can be useful, but they should be used for one task, and they should be used, again, in a conscientious fashion so that we don't inadvertently cross-contaminate produce with gloves that are dirty. And on the subject of cross-contamination, so cross-contamination is the transfer of harmful substances or disease-causing microorganisms to items that can then contaminate produce. Okay, so again, it could be food, utensils, food contact surfaces, equipment, or clean surfaces. There are lots of ways that we can transfer harmful substances or microorganisms. Sometimes we do it unwittingly. But again, very important to cultivate that culture of food safety when it comes to reducing cross-contamination. Very important. So how do we lower the safety risk from the standpoint of health and hygiene? Well, again, the best practice is to wash your hands. Hopefully I've stressed that enough tonight. Wash your hands with soap and potable, clean running water, and dry your hands using single-use towels. If clean running water is not available, then certainly disposable single-use gloves can be helpful in harvesting, but again, they are not a substitute for washing hands. If a task is maintenance only, then you might consider using traditional gardening gloves, again, where there's no risk of cross-contamination affecting produce. Do we have any questions at this point, Hannah?
No questions at this time.
Okay. Now let's turn our attention to water and irrigation. The number one source of contamination is water. Now, I said earlier the number one source is poop, but again, poop is what contaminates water, and water is what spreads a small risk and turns it into a large risk. So again, water is the number one source of contamination. So anytime water comes into contact with fresh produce, the water's quality determines the potential for pathogen contamination. I don't frequently read slides, but this is really important to understand. Remember that water may be a carrier of a number of types of microorganisms. Now let's think about when water might come into contact with fresh produce. Well, it could be during irrigation. It could be during spraying. It could be at harvest when we're washing produce. It could be at other points along that continuum from the produce field to the fork going into the consumer's mouth. But again, anytime water comes into contact with fresh produce, there is a risk there if we don't understand the quality of that water. Now, how do we understand the quality of that water? Well, the first thing to consider is the source of the water. Where does your water come from? And depending upon the source, there is a building level of risk. So if we start with a public water supply, for example, water that's supplied by a city or a county or a water authority, that water is frequently treated to make it microbially safe, and it is regularly tested to ensure that the treatment is working. In other words, it's delivered to you in a potable condition, a safe condition, and this is by far the safest water source. What about groundwater? What about water coming from a well? Well, we can't assume that groundwater is safe. We don't know until it's been tested. Now, in many cases, groundwater is potable. Groundwater is safe. Without testing, you can never assume that. What about surface water? What about water in a pond or a lake or a stream, or perhaps water that's been collected off of a greenhouse surface or a roof and captured? Well, these are all considered to be surface water, water that is open to the environment. And surface water carries a much higher degree of risk relative to contamination. Again, we don't have control over what enters that water. And so if we think about risk management, the safest water is coming from a public water supply, next from a groundwater source, and the least safe is coming from surface water. And in fact, there are several points in handling produce where we will not use surface water because we cannot ensure that it is potable or drinking water quality. We'll talk about that here in a moment. So again, the first step is to determine the water source during planting of the farm or the garden and to understand the safety of that source. Whenever possible, avoid unregulated sources. Avoid rivers, streams, irrigation ditches, wells, or ponds. There may be some situations where this may be the only source, and if used properly, this water can be used early in the production process of growing fruits and vegetables. But once we harvest crops, once we move beyond the production field, then all water that comes into contact with produce must be potable. All water that we use for washing our hands, that we use for cleaning our tools, that we use for cleaning harvest containers must be potable. Again, another precaution here, there's an assumption that collected rainwater is safe, and the answer is that it is not. Collected rainwater, rain barrels, this is all water that's being collected off a surface that is open to contamination. So if you choose to use collected rainwater or rain barrels, it's very important to test this water to understand the water quality. Now, how do we test the water? Well, we provide that water to a lab that conducts a testing protocol to help us understand the level of contamination in the water. In Missouri, the Missouri Department of Health, through local county offices, offers water testing. There are also private labs which offer water testing. But particularly if you plan to use a subsurface source, such as a well, or a surface source, it's very important that that water source be tested so that you can understand the contamination potential for the water. Now, a primary way that crops come into contact with water is through irrigation. And this is another aspect of risk management. And the way that we irrigate carries varying degrees of risk. For example, if we use an overhead approach to watering, such as a sprinkler, this is higher risk. The direct water application definitely is going to contact produce. What about flood, surface, or furrow? This can be less risky. In many cases, you don't have direct contact with produce, but there can still be splash or other movement of water from an open ditch or a furrow. Drip or trickle. This is the safest way to irrigate crops. It's lower risk. Produce generally does not come into contact with water, except in the case of root crops, such as onions, radishes, those types of crops. It reduces foliar diseases as well and improves water use efficiency. So it's a good way to irrigate crops. But again, recognize that as we move from overhead irrigation to drip, we move from a more risky to a less risky way of irrigating crops. And again, remember, the less contact with water, the lower the risk. And a key question for evaluation of risk is the water applied using a direct water application method? So if the answer is never, the risk from water is very low. In other words, if we don't contact crops with water that we've applied, the risk is very low. But if the answer is yes, the type of commodity, the quality of the water, and the timing of the application should be reviewed to assess risk. So in other words, the type of commodity. Are we growing a type of commodity where the harvested part that we're going to then market or eat, is it going to come into contact with water unavoidably? What about the quality of the water? If the water is clean, if it's potable, then the risk is very low. And the closer that we apply water to harvest, the more risk that we have associated with that water application. There's evidence that microorganisms will die off over time on crops that are out in the environment. So if for example, we inadvertently water a crop with contaminated water, but it's a long time from that point to harvest, that's much less risky than if we inadvertently contaminate crops close to harvest. So again, the timing of the application is important as well. As we get close to harvest, it's a good practice to switch over to potable quality water. In other words, drinking water quality water. Again, this can be very helpful from the standpoint of risk management. Now, we've harvested the crop. What about washing it? What about washing produce? Well, at this point, we have to use potable water. At this point, we recognize that there is a strong risk of contaminating produce if we use water that is not clean. So at this point, all washing should be done with potable water. Single-use water is best. What this means is that we fill a container with water, we wash one batch of produce, and then we dispose of that water before we bring in another batch of produce. The reason for this is that it can be a situation where we might inadvertently contaminate that first batch of water, and then if we use that same water for another batch of produce, there can be additional risk of contamination. So single-use water is better than multiple-use water. What about putting a sanitizer in the water? What about treating the water with something that will help with killing microbes? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that using sanitizer in water is not an effort to wash produce. As I said before, once contamination occurs, very difficult or impossible to clean up the produce. But what the sanitizer can help with is the microorganisms that might move from one piece of produce in the water to another piece of produce. So in this case, a sanitizer could be helpful. But again, the best approach, don't use water if you don't have to. If you do use water, single-use water is best. If you are using water, and particularly if you're using water from more than one batch of produce, then consider using a sanitizer. Now, what can we do to lower the safety risk? Well, again, use a regulated treated water source that meets EPA drinking water standards. In other words, it's potable for irrigation, washing produce, hand washing, and applying chemicals. If you plan to use a non-treated water source, such as a well, make sure that you test that water. Make sure that it is up to EPA and FDA standards before you use it for watering or washing. Again, don't assume that a well is clean. You don't know that until that water has been tested. And then consider using drip irrigation in the garden or in the field. This can be very helpful from the standpoint of risk management. Do we have any questions at this point, Hannah?
It doesn't appear so.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Now let's talk about soil, manure, and compost. Now, as I said before, our goal from the standpoint of managing risk is to keep the poop off the produce. And one of the things that is a bit tricky about this is that we really don't understand clearly how long human pathogens can survive in manure once it's been applied to a field or a garden. We know that there have been situations where pathogens can survive for a year or longer. So we really don't have a good handle on this. And so again, it's very important to be proactive to prevent contamination. And so until we understand more clearly, we don't have clear guidance from the Food and Drug Administration on this. Likely that guidance will come along at some point once additional research has been conducted to help understand this. But at the present, a good recommendation is to follow what's called the NOP standards. NOP means the National Organic Program Standards. And what those standards say is that with high-risk crops, with crops where there is a strong likelihood that contamination could occur, from manure or something else applied to the soil, 120 days from the manure application to harvest of the crop. So in other words, you have to allow at least 120 days from when you apply manure to when you harvest a crop off of that part of the field that received the manure. With lower risk crop, 90 days. from manure application to harvest. So what would be an example of a high-risk crop? Well, something like leafy greens or strawberries. What would be an example of a lower-risk crop? Well, something like trellis tomatoes or apples or blueberries, where the part of the crop that we're going to harvest is well above the soil. So is it manure or is it compost? This is a good question, and there's a certain amount of confusion relative to the safety of amendments that we apply, particularly amendments that sometimes have names that can confuse us. So it's very important to understand if what we're applying is actually manure or compost. And the reason for this is that manure carries a risk, but if compost has been properly prepared, the risk that was there initially is much lower. So again, very important to understand the true nature of amendments that we apply to gardens or production fields. So compost versus manure. Now, unless the compost has been produced under very strictly regulated circumstances, then it is manure, and it should be treated as such. And this includes not only raw manure, but it also includes aged manure or stacked manure or manure that's been on a pile for several years. It includes untreated manure slurries that might be pulled out of a lagoon. It includes compost teas made with raw manure. And basically, it includes any soil amendment of animal origin not treated with a scientifically valid process to reduce pathogens. So our concern here is not just manure, but perhaps other amendments of animal origin. So again, these all carry a strong likelihood of contamination, and we have to understand this. So again, it's not just raw manure, but it's other terms that we sometimes hear like aged manure or manure-based compost tea. So what is it that makes compost safe? Well, some things to think about. If the compost was made strictly from plant-based raw materials, that's generally safer than animal-based compost. Now, it doesn't completely guarantee that there's no risk of contamination, but generally, if there's not an animal-based component, the compost that results is safer. Commercial compost, which has been produced under standardized conditions, is generally safe. Now, growers or farmers who are subject to the produce safety rule, which is part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, before using commercial compost should request from the compost supplier a written guarantee that the compost was produced using a standardized treatment process. And then on-farm compost, or compost produced in the garden. If it's produced under the proper conditions, it too is considered to be generally safe. But I will mention at this point that to achieve these proper conditions, it can be a bit of a challenge on a farm or in a garden setting. So what are some examples of safe composting processes that can result in a biologically safe compost? Well, here's a couple of options. The first is a static composting option. This is where a pile is created. It's an aerobic situation. The pile must heat up to at least 55 degrees for 3 days, 3 consecutive days, followed by curing with proper insulation. How do we know if it's heated up to that point? Well, we use a compost thermometer, and we place that compost thermometer at several different places in the pile to make sure that uniformly the pile has reached that temperature, that 131 degrees temperature. If it's a turn composting situation, this too is aerobic, and again, a minimum of 131 degrees for 15 days, a minimum of 5 turnings, and again, followed by curing with proper insulation. So if we can achieve these conditions, these would be examples of scientifically valid processes that would result in a compost that is considered to be microbially safe. Now, what about applying compost? Well, if it is indeed compost and we know that it's microbially safe, there's no restrictions in terms of the days of application and the time that we harvest the crop. Now, that being said, it's still a good practice to err on the side of caution with crops such as leafy greens that are particularly prone to contamination. Where should we locate the compost pile relative to the areas that we're growing? Well, first of all, unfinished compost must be kept out of the garden or out of the field. Unfinished compost is considered to be unsafe. Place the pile as far as possible from the garden or field. If possible, place the pile downhill from the garden or the field. And then watch out for compost contamination. Now, what might cause compost contamination? Well, certainly adding additional raw stocks to a already treated pile could do that. But the activity of animals, particularly animals such as feral cats, can very quickly contaminate a compost pile. And in urban settings, feral cats are particularly troublesome from the standpoint of compost. And it's a good practice to keep that compost pile covered so that you can ensure that it has not been contaminated. So what can we do to lower the safety risk? Well, the best practice is to put compost bins or piles as far away from the garden, and in most cases assume that on-site composting that includes manure does not produce microbially safe compost. In other words, treat it as you would raw manure and observe the 120 or 90-day intervals between application and harvest of the crop. Do not harvest at-risk produce within 120 days of an application of manure or a compost that you're not completely sure about. And whenever possible, incorporate compost into the soil as soon as possible. Do we have any questions at this point, Hannah?
No questions or Q&A.
Let's talk about animals in the garden or the field. We mentioned that the goal of produce safety risk management is to keep the poop off the produce, and certainly animals can be a source of that poop. So let's talk a bit about animals in the garden and field. So animal feces are a primary source of contamination. Okay, the feces carry a strong risk of microbial contamination, and they again can introduce microorganisms into the garden or into the field. Now, oftentimes their activity is not immediately obvious. We have to watch. We have to develop an eye to help us understand when there has been evidence of animals in the field. Now, certainly there can be physical evidence, tracks, damage, browsing, feeding, that sort of thing. But what we're particularly looking for is evidence of manure, animal manure. Now, it can be difficult to keep animals out of production areas, out of gardens and fields. We recognize this. Birds can fly over fences, deer can jump over fences, animals can get under fences, and in some cases we may have domestic animals or pets that have access to production fields or gardens as well. So there are many ways that animals can get into these areas, and we have to, again, develop an eye for looking for evidence of animal intrusion or animal presence in produce areas. Now, we should think about excluding animals from gardens or fields whenever possible. Some strategies: fencing, repellents, scarecrows, or other ways of scaring animals. There are trapping or lethal methods, but recognize before you trap an animal that you must abide by the wildlife code in your particular state. Here in Missouri, that code is determined by the Missouri Department of Conservation, and very important that you abide by those codes. Lethal methods, of course, in some cases, damage control permits may be issued where animals can be destroyed. But again, recognize that even trapping and relocation in many cases is a lethal method. When you take an animal and you trap it and move it away from its home territory and introduce it into a new area, in many cases that animal will not understand where it's been placed, it will not have access to food sources, and will eventually die. So trapping and relocation can be just as deadly as lethal methods. Please keep that in mind. Some more thoughts. Again, whenever possible, keep domestic animals away from gardens. Certainly keep domestic animals away from harvest and handling areas. There's nothing that causes me more distress than to see an animal, a dog or a cat, in an area where produce is being handled after harvest, and especially a cat sitting on a surface where produce is going to be placed. Again, recognize these animals, even though they're pets, can be sources of contamination. So do not allow dogs, cats, or other pets into the garden, packaging, or storage facilities. And as I mentioned earlier, keep the compost bin covered. Again, it's very easy for the activities of animals to contaminate compost. Now, what can we do to lower the safety risk? Consider fencing. Fencing is very important, even in urban areas, to keep animals out, such as deer, feral dogs, those sorts of things. Keep your pets under control. Do not allow pets into the garden or the field. Make a good faith effort to keep animals out. Prune back perches, use repellents, do other things that you can do to make the area less attractive to animals. And then it's very important to scout the garden or the field before harvest. We'll talk more about this here in a moment. But a very important aspect from the standpoint of managing the risk of contamination at harvest is to carefully examine the crops before harvest, looking for evidence of animals. You're certainly looking for poop. You're also looking for evidence that animals have been there. Again, things such as browsing, tracks, damage to crops. These are all things to look for. Because if animals have been in there, there's a strong likelihood that sooner, some point in the field, they pooped. So if you see evidence of animals in the field, then redouble your efforts to look for poop contamination. Do we have any questions at this point, Hannah?
It doesn't appear so.
Okay, very good. Let's talk about harvest and post-harvest handling of crops. And again, we can do everything right in the field and we can just abide by all of the rules at this point. But if there's a problem at harvest and post-harvest, it can very quickly contaminate a large amount of produce. So we have to be very conscious of produce food safety as we harvest and handle crops, as we get those crops from the production field to the people who are going to enjoy the produce. So some things to consider from the standpoint of harvest. First of all, pick crops dry. There are strong reasons from the standpoint of maintaining quality in produce to pick at this point, but when your hands are wet and produce items are wet, it's very easy to spread contamination, in other words, cross-contamination. So make sure that you pick crops whenever possible when they're dry. Crops that visibly show evidence of bird droppings or manure must not be harvested and used for human consumption. Again, this is just a very basic tenet of produce food safety. If you see visible evidence of contamination, then obviously that crop has been contaminated. And as I mentioned before, you cannot clean up produce that has been contaminated, so that produce must be discarded. We also need to think about inadvertent contamination. So if we have identified, for example, poop in a produce field or in a garden, then we need to be thinking about collateral damage, collateral contamination that may have taken place around where we visibly see the poop. Now, some things to keep in mind, what is the nature of the poop? Is it dry and discrete like deer droppings? Or is it loose where there might be more movement, such as in the case of cow manure? Has it rained since the poop was deposited? Rain can very quickly spread poop to a neighboring produce. Has someone stepped in it? Has there been a tractor tire that's run over it? All of these things can spread contamination from the initial point at where it was deposited. It's a good practice to establish a no harvest zone around areas where you definitely see evidence of poop. Now, again, the extent of this no harvest zone depends upon those factors that I just mentioned. But at the very least, don't harvest any produce items where you physically see evidence of droppings or manure. And then consider an area at least a foot in or 1 to 3 feet out from where you see the visible evidence of contamination. And don't harvest that produce either. And there's just too much risk associated with produce in the vicinity of where poop has been identified. Remember that at harvest, all water should be potable. All water used for washing crops, all water used for washing surfaces, for washing harvest containers, for washing tools, and for washing hands must be potable. Make sure that you clean and sanitize tools and totes frequently, at least on a daily basis, and more often if you see visible evidence of soil or contamination. Make sure that the surfaces that you place produce on can be cleaned and sanitized. For example, it's much easier to clean a stainless steel surface versus a plywood surface, again, just by the nature of the surface. So think carefully about the surfaces you're going to use to place produce on. And always think about, can I adequately clean and sanitize that surface? Once produce has been harvested, it should be quickly cooled. There are some microorganisms where the rate of growth can be slowed or even stopped if produce is quickly cooled. Not all biological contaminants, but many will respond in this way. Make sure that you deliver produce promptly. And again, it's so important at this point that everyone understand about proper hand washing. Make sure that you provide adequate hand washing facilities, be it in a community garden, on farm, or even in the home garden. Sometimes we get a little careless in home gardens, but the risk is there just as much as it is in a community garden or on a farm. So again, make sure that everyone understands about proper hand washing. What about harvest containers? Well, it's very important that harvest containers be maintained in a clean and sanitary state. Again, very easy to cross-contaminate produce if you pick it into a dirty container. Now let's think about what these containers are made of. We look at that upper picture there, we see community gardeners that are harvesting into cardboard containers. Now, for a single-use situation, if the cardboard is clean, this can be a good way to harvest produce. But recognize that cardboard containers very quickly become soiled, and you cannot adequately clean and sanitize a cardboard container. So if there's any evidence of these containers being soiled, they should be discarded. What about plastic bags? Looking over at those plastic bags, if you salvage plastic bags from a market, if you save plastic bags that have had other items in them and then use them for harvesting produce, this carries a strong risk of cross-contamination because you really don't know what was in that bag. There may have been items that could cause microbial contamination, such as raw meat, for example, or other items that had soil on the outside. So recognize that. What about paper bags, as we see in the lower there? Well, again, for a single use, for a delivery, these might be a possibility. But again, paper bags carry a strong risk of contamination, and be very cautious about reusing paper bags. What about plastic buckets or totes? These are excellent containers for harvest or delivery. But again, make sure that these containers are cleaned and sanitized regularly. And whenever you visibly see evidence of soil, these containers must be cleaned. What about plastic harvest totes like we see on the lower left there? Again, these can be used, but the types that we see here with all of these openings can be difficult to clean and sanitize. Again, bacteria can lodge in all of those openings. A solid container would be a better choice from the standpoint of a surface that can be easily and effectively cleaned and sanitized. So think carefully about your harvest containers and the containers in which you're going to take produce to market or to delivery. Now, what about the areas in which you plan to pack and sort produce? Well, you can certainly use portable surfaces. You can use tables that can be broken down and moved, but make sure the surfaces are such that you can clean and sanitize them. Plastic tables, for example, are an excellent surface to use for packing and sorting. Recognize, though, after a period of time, these tabletops, plastic tabletops, will become scratched and otherwise damaged. And at that point, it does become more difficult to make sure that all of those scratches are adequately cleaned and sanitized. Bacteria can lodge in surfaces. This is a good point to talk about cleaning these surfaces. Recognize that you can't sanitize a surface until it's been cleaned. And when we talk about cleaning a surface, that means, first of all, wetting down the surface. Secondly, using a detergent or soap. Third, using vigorous physical action to scrub down that surface. The reason you have to physically scrub down a surface is that what you're targeting now are what are called biofilms. Over time, bacteria and other contaminants build up in a layer of saps, resins, and other sticky substances on surfaces. And these are very difficult to remove unless you physically remove them with a scrubbing action. Okay, once you physically scrub the area, then rinse it off, and then at that point use a sanitizer. The sanitizer can be sprayed on, and then follow the sanitizer label to understand whether or not you need to rinse that surface off again after the use of the sanitizer. What about the area in which you're going to pack and sort? Can it be an open area? Can it be under a tent or under some sort of open area? Certainly it can, but recognize that this is a bit more risky because animals can move into and out of these areas. Enclosed structures are better because you maintain more control over what can enter this area. But regardless of where you're packing and sorting, do everything you can to exclude birds, rodents, insects, pests, and unauthorized persons. And again, I talked about cleaning and sanitizing surfaces. Pay special attention to surfaces that contact produce. Now let's review again cleaning and sanitizing. So the first step, removing visible soil. This is done with rinsing, then placing a detergent or a soap, and then washing vigorously, and then rinsing with potable water. What about sanitizing tools and containers? Once the surface is clean or you've got a clean tool or a container to sanitize, a good material to use is 50 to 200 parts per million food grade bleach solution. And this is about 1 teaspoon to 1 tablespoon of bleach per gallon of potable water. Now, very important to check the label, okay? We're going to watch a video here in a moment that reinforces that, but the label must say on it somewhere that that particular material, be it a bleach or whatever the sanitizer might be, is suitable for use on food contact surfaces or is suitable for use where it contacts produce. If it doesn't say that on the label, it cannot legally be used to sanitize surfaces that will contact produce. It also cannot be used in, for example, wash water or dunk water that would come into contact with produce. Okay, let's go ahead and watch a video now on sanitizing. Okay, Hannah, can we see the video?
Yes.
Okay. A sanitizer is a chemical that, if used at the proper concentration, will kill microorganisms or reduce their numbers to a non-harmful level. Sanitizers are used in several ways related to fresh produce. They may be used in water that comes into contact with fruits or vegetables at or after harvest, or they may be part of a multi-step process of cleaning and sanitizing that reduces the level of pathogens on food contact surfaces to acceptable levels. In the United States, sanitizers are regulated at the federal level by the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, as antimicrobial pesticides. There is an approval process which is involved and exhaustive, and the result is an approved label. The label governs the correct use of the sanitizer. It also, if label directions are followed, limits the product's risk to humans, wildlife, and the environment. An approved label, an approved EPA label, includes an EPA registration number. And the EPA also reviews any statements that are made on the product label. There may be additional regulation at the state level. Again, many states regulate pesticides, and this regulation may vary from state to state. It's important for people who plan to use sanitizers to consult their state agency that regulates pesticide use. If a person is going to be using a product as a sanitizer that does not have an EPA label, the user should be prepared to prove that that product is suitable for the intended use. The choice of a sanitizer is based on several considerations. First of all, of course, safety for the people who will be using the sanitizer and for the environment, but also whether or not that particular sanitizer is corrosive, how it might interact with the surfaces on which it's going to be used, and also the characteristics of the sanitizer relative to things such as water pH and temperature. The commonly used sanitizers for food contact surfaces and for water use during harvest and post-harvest activities are, first of all, based upon chlorine. The first label here is an example of a product that is based upon chlorine. Another group of sanitizers that are frequently used are based upon quaternary ammonium compounds. A third group is based upon peroxyacetic acid. And then occasionally we have sanitizers that might have more than one active ingredient, in this case peroxyacetic acid and hydrogen peroxide. All sanitizers that are approved for use by the Environmental Protection Agency will have a label. The antimicrobial product label will describe the approved uses, such as for water or for food contact surfaces, as well as approved concentrations or dosages. The first thing to look for on the label is the name of the product. In this case, it's Perox Extreme. Then take a look at what the active ingredient is. In this case, it's a combination of hydrogen peroxide and peroxyacetic acid. The next thing to look for is the EPA registration number. All labels that are approved by the Environmental Protection Agency will have a registration number. Other material that will be on the label will talk about things such as hazards to humans and domestic animals, the proper storage and disposal of the product or the container, but very importantly, there'll be information on how to safely use the product. Again, directions for uses. In this case, we're considering using this particular sanitizer for hard, non-porous food contact surfaces, as we see down here. And we will definitely read through that section to understand how to use it. The information on the concentration is right here. And what's particularly important is information on which microorganisms this particular sanitizer will control. And we see down here in this section that it will control Staphylococcus aureus, Escherichia coli, Listeria monocytogenes, and Salmonella typhimurium.
Everything okay?
Yes. Okay, any questions at this point, Hannah?
No questions.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen back again. Okay. So now let's talk a bit about storage areas. And it's very important from the standpoint of the harvest and post-harvest aspect of produce food safety to have a secure place to store your tools, your harvest containers, your bags, your work gloves, and other items. And this should be a storage area that is not the same as a storage area where you're keeping things that are dirty or things that have a potential risk such as chemicals or anything like that. So again, a separate discrete storage area for your tools, your harvest containers, bags, work gloves, and other items. Your cold storage should be secure as well because contamination can occur in cold storage just as it can in the open. So cold storage areas should be secure. What about damaged produce, produce that's punctured or bruised? Well, keep in mind that produce that has been damaged or bruised, if contamination has entered that produce item, it's impossible to clean it up. And keep in mind too that punctured or bruised produce is also has quality issues, and this can be a negative as well. But from the standpoint of potential contamination, damaged produce should be culled. It should not be graded and packed with sound produce. Again, this is an important aspect of risk management. Now, what about moving produce? So when you're delivering produce, it's important to think about the process. Okay, first of all, let's think about what we're going to move it in. We're going to use a wheelbarrow, as we see here in this picture, or a wagon, or a truck, or a van, or the trunk of a car. Let's think about what was used or what was hauled in that area prior. Looking at this wheelbarrow, it could have been a very easy situation where that wheelbarrow may have been used to move manure, to move compost, or to move something else that might be a potential source of contamination for produce items. Now, obviously, it's helpful that the produce is inside bags in the wheelbarrow, but it's very important that vehicles that have hauled raw animal products, especially manure, should be cleaned and sanitized before delivering produce. So again, this wheelbarrow should have been cleaned and sanitized. How do we clean and sanitize? Well, let's review that again. We first rinse it out, then we apply soap or detergent. We use a vigorous scrubbing action. We rinse and then we sanitize. The same thing applies to the beds of pickup trucks, the insides of vans, the trunks of cars. We want to be very cautious about the risk of cross-contamination from the vehicle or the piece of equipment that we're using to transport produce. What about washing produce? Well, we talked about that earlier, but I'll just reinforce that if you are going to wash produce, it must be potable water. For immediate use, you can certainly wash produce at the garden. And again, make sure that if you're washing, if you're otherwise cleaning the surfaces, the containers, the equipment, it must be such that it can be cleaned and sanitized. If produce is going to be delivered, it's best not to wash. And in fact, don't wash produce if you don't have to. It's a good practice, particularly if you're a vendor at a farmer's market where you directly see consumers, that you let them know that it's important to wash produce when they get home. But whenever possible, don't wash produce. Remember that water is a primary source of contamination, and an important part of risk management is not to wash produce if we don't absolutely have to. Now, what can we do to lower the safety risk? Well, let's wear single-use gloves when harvesting, and let's put the harvest into clean single-use containers or containers that can be cleaned and sanitized. Remember that slide where we talked about the difference. Make sure that hands are washed before harvesting. Make sure hands are washed whenever they're contaminated. Scout the garden before harvest. Remember that there is that risk of manure from animals entering the garden. So always scout the garden or the field before harvest to look for evidence of manure contamination. If you see manure contamination, establish a no harvest zone around the point of contamination. Make sure that work surfaces, tools, and equipment can be properly cleaned and sanitized. And make sure that any vehicle or equipment that you use to transport produce is clean. If there's any question there, clean it. Well, here are some resources that I would definitely recommend to learn more about produce food safety. Certainly the Produce Safety Alliance. This is the outreach branch of the Food and Drug Administration, Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. Lots of excellent resources there, as I mentioned early in the presentation. The resources available at the North Carolina Community Gardens website, very helpful. The Kansas State University Produce Safety page has a wealth of information as well, including information on registering for the 8-hour produce safety rule training that's coming up in January. So at this point, this brings us to the end of our overview of produce food safety. Hannah, do we have any questions at this point?
No, we do not.
Okay, very good. Well, again, I want to encourage anyone who has any questions related to produce food safety to please reach out and ask those questions. It's much better to be informed than it is to have questions when it comes to something as important as produce food safety. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I'm glad that you have an interest in produce food safety. I'm glad that you share my concern with providing produce that is as safe as possible to the people that are going to enjoy the fruits and vegetables of our labors. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Oh, thank you, Hannah.